Sunland Derby on Sunday. Let's take a look at that field. You had 9 of them signed on. Post-time favorite, Mucho Gusto down on the inside for Bob Baffert. But there were alternatives. You had the second choice in here who, surprisingly enough, the amount of late money that just flew in for Cutting Humor, he ended up being your second choice, going out for Pletcher and Velasquez. Your third choice at 7-2 was Another Twist of Fate, coming down from Northern California, the big blowout winner of the race up at Golden Gate, the El Camino Real Derby over synthetic. Would he be able to handle the main track? In fact, he could handle it, but there was another horse that just got the measure of him. Here's the stretch run of this year's Sunland Derby.
Outside and Mucho Gusto, and they turn together. Mucho Gusto digs in on the inside. Mucho Gusto, Cutting Humor, now Another Twist of Fate, lets loose and down the center, tries to run down Cutting Humor. Cutting Humor, Another Twist of Fate, Another Twist of Fate coming with every stride as they go to the wire. Cutting Humor just got in from Another Twist of Fate. 6 away, Mucho Gusto.
Cutting Humor gets the job done at odds of 2-1 over Another Twist of Fate, who runs second, just beaten by a neck. They are nearly 6 lengths clear of Mucho Gusto, the beaten favorite, at odds of 4-5. Wicked indeed. Rounds out your superfecta in a very formful race. The top 4 choices run 1 through 4. Let's take a look at Cutting Humor. He's 2 of 6 lifetime, 5 times in the money from 6 lifetime starts, just over $500,000 in career earnings. Owned by Starlight Racing, trained by Todd Pletcher, bred by Del Hancock and Bernie Sims in Kentucky. Ridden to victory by John Velasquez, and you can see the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card. He's by First Samurai out of a pulpit mare named Pun. 95 Beyer speed figure for Cutting Humor, winning this year's Sunland Derby. Another Twist of Fate, a 94 Beyer, Mucho Gusto, an 85. From a time form standpoint, a little bit of a difference from what we saw in the Louisiana Derby, where basically the two figures sort of checked out. They matched up with one another. This race here, a little bit different. Cutting Humor, this 95 Beyer, his pace-adjusted time form U.S. rating is a 112, so they're relatively close. But if you take the pace situation out of it, it's only a 109. So one of the numbers seems a little bit higher than the other, or vice versa. One is a little bit lower than it probably should be. For what it's worth, quarter, half, and three-quarter splits, all color-coded red according to Timeform US. But I like the way that the top 2 finished. I like the way that they both ran. I think they're both very, very nice horses. As I said in the preview pod last week, Cutting Humor, he's just a little bit of a quirky horse, but I really believe the talent is there, and that kind of bore out here. He was much more relaxed this time around. Velasquez kept him in the clear throughout, never really had to deal with anything in front of him. He finishes in 12-18. Again, go back to that Louisiana Derby talk that we just had, talking about the idea of that final 1/8 of a mile. How does that sort of compare and project forward for another 1/8 of a mile, knowing that you got to get 10 furlongs in the Kentucky Derby? 12-18, that's pretty legitimate. That's a nice finishing time. You take a look at Another Twist of Fate. He finishes in 11:97, even faster. I think each of these top 2 horses, I think they're both legitimate prospects going forward here for a race like the Kentucky Derby. And I've seen a lot of people bring up that, you know, the most wide open 3-year-old group that we've had in a number of years, and the most wide open this, and since the point system has been implemented, I have no idea who's going to win. I agree with the idea that it is an open group, and it may not be a spectacular group. It's a solid group at this point. And as I've said a number of times in the past years, it's way, way too early for folks making definitive statements saying it's a bad crop, it's a good crop, it's X, it's Y. It's March of their 3-year-old season. You don't know if they're any good. I don't know if they're any good. Right now, they look solid. Not spectacular, but solid. And to say that, well, it's the most wide open group, keep in mind, we have had one 100-point prep run so far. You still have all those other races still to go. I have a feeling this thing's going to get a hell of a lot clearer in the next, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks when they run the Florida Derby, when they run, I know the UAE Derby, say what you will, the Santa Anita Derby, the Wood Memorial, the Bluegrass, the Arkansas Derby. All those races are still to be run. And I think things will probably get a little bit clearer as we go through those. I digress. I like both of these horses stretching out. I think the prospects of them going longer, not an issue. Cutting Humor is still a little bit on the funny side, a little bit quirky. Johnny V was quoted after the race saying he idled once he hit the front. I tend to agree with him because you saw it almost looked like he was getting a little bit choppy at the very end, and I wonder if he was just waiting on somebody to come and play with him, come and race with him. Again, a situation as I related to Spinoff, you know, not necessarily ideal, going forward, knowing that you're going to have to deal with more horses, more distance, bigger crowd, all that kind of stuff. But I think this is a promising enough effort for a horse like Cunning Humor, thinking that going forward, distance isn't going to be a problem for him. The connections are there, Velasquez and Pletcher. Johnny V is going to have an interesting sort of few weeks ahead of him. Ultimately, going to have to find out which mount he ends up choosing. But Pletcher, all of a sudden, for all the folks saying that, you know, there's no Todd 3-year-olds, no Todd 3-year-olds. Well, all of a sudden he has two that look like they are ready to go. And he still has the Florida race, the New York race, the Kentucky race. Still got a number of things, Arkansas. So you could easily see a number of Pletchers all of a sudden pop up. Better late than never. I just think this is a nice horse, and I think there's reason to believe that he's going to continue to improve. As for Another Twist of Fate, I had said I wasn't picking him. I thought he was a bad bet at 2-1, that he was in the morning line, or 5-2, whatever it was. Going off at 7-2, still wouldn't have been my cup of tea, but I liked the way that he ran. He was not up there sort of being crazy as far as headstrong, trying to pull. He rated kindly, sat in behind horses, got a little bit of a shuffle, rounding the far turn, took him a moment, finally angled out, followed Cutting Humor, and boy, he was getting to him. You give him another 3 or 4 jumps, I wonder if Another Twist of Fate gets it done. To me, that bodes very well going forward for another 1/8 of a mile. And I just think the bigger, most important piece for me with Another Twist of Fate in this race is he proved that he can handle the dirt, that the dirt is not an issue. Perhaps he's going to be a superior animal on synthetic and turf, but he can handle the dirt. I think he's one that you need to keep an eye on going forward. And really for this race, that's all there is to really talk about. Mucho Gusto, he showed speed. Again, time form had those fractions fast early on. It was a disappointing effort. I expected there to be some resistance. You know, you can't just wilt the way that you did. You were never even in the same area code as those top two. Now I go back and look at it and say, okay, well, was the Robert Lewis effort a product of the wet track? Was it a product of, as I had mentioned, beating potentially inferior company, An Easy Shot and Gunmetal Gray? Gunmetal Gray, unfortunately, sidelined now. Not a great effort, and I don't know that you necessarily go on to a race like the Kentucky Derby on the heels of this. Baffert and the connections know, again, much more than I do, but if I were involved, I don't know that I would be in a hurry to go on to a race like the Kentucky Derby on the heels of an effort like this. Be much more interested in trying to turn him back to a 1-turn mile, run him in the Pate, perhaps, on the Derby undercard, and then going from there, if he runs well there, maybe you want to try to run him in the Preakness 2 weeks later. Maybe at that point, then you start plotting ahead and say he's a 1-turn kind of 7/8 type. We'll find out, but Mucho Gusto, definitely a disappointing effort here. And as far as the rest of the field is concerned, they looked overmatched on paper going into it. iCloud, 164-1, tip of the cap to those connections. You run 5th. You beat this field. You split the field anyway in a field of 9. But the top two, they both ran very credible races. I think they're both really talented. I think there is ability here. Cutting Humor, Another Twist of Fate. Cutting Humor, I think he still has a few little things that he needs to tighten up mentally. Not dissimilar from his stablemate Spinoff, who we saw run second there in the Louisiana Derby. But he is up. I like his tactical ability. I like the fact that distance, I don't think is going to be an issue for him. You take a look at that pedigree, I feel like he's going to want to run all day. Cutting Humor, he's a very, very interesting candidate going forward, as is the runner-up, Another Twist of Fate. I have a feeling Another Twist of Fate won a lot of fans over in this race on Sunday, and I do wonder if that will eventually hurt him going forward from a gambling standpoint. Maybe he'll be a little bit of the wise guy horse going into the Kentucky Derby. But really, when it's all said and done, I think they're both legitimate candidates at this point anyway, from what we've seen. And I believe wholeheartedly that things will get a little bit clearer in the next few weeks. But even with that said, I think these top two, I think they both have earned their spot in the Kentucky Derby. Cutting Humor gets the better of Another Twist of Fate. They're separated by a neck in this year's Sunland Derby. 95 Beyer, 112 Timeform US rating for Cutting Humor winning the Sunland Derby.